Hello everyone, and welcome to today's video from the Tank Encyclopedia. I'm Vulcan, most people know me as Vulcan HD Gaming. Today I'm here to talk to you about the TOG-300. If you are interested in more information about tanks, make sure to browse the Tank Encyclopedia website for more information, and if you like strategy game content, then make sure to check out my channel, Vulcan HD Gaming. Let's crack on and talk about the wonderful TOG-300. The precipitous plunge into a new major European land war against Germany in 1939 found the British utterly unprepared for the type of intense combat fought a generation earlier on much of the same ground in northern France and Belgium. As Britain and France raced desperately to design and deliver a new series of heavy tanks able to break the inevitable German defensive lines, the mud of Flanders loomed large in British military thought. The French army and the British Expeditionary Force had tanks and a lot of modern equipment of a bewildering variety and utility. From the diminutive, unarmed UE-tracked resupply vehicle and obsolete World War I Renault FT light tanks, to the Char B1 heavy tank for the French, and the Universal Carrier and Mark IV light tank to the A11 and A12 Matildas of the British. These forces were meant, as succeeded by their parents' generation, to blunt and stall the German advance through the Low Countries. After that, the Allies would bring over new forces and push the Germans back. A fine plan maybe in the first months, September and October of 1939, with the obvious problem that Germans didn't want to play that game, and instead, when in May 1940 the attack came, it was launched with greater speed and focus of intensity than the British and French could cope with. Picturing a need in the first months of the war for a new and improved heavy tank for special purposes, there was no suitable vehicle at all, as the heaviest tank available was the A12 Matilda. A new tank was to be rapidly considered, and one of the first of these came from a team led by Sir Albert Stern, a team of men largely responsible for most of the British tanks of World War I. Stern was the chairman of the Special Vehicle Development Committee, more commonly known by its adopted name, the Old Gang, and this was to be the first TOG tank of World War II. However, it never left the drawing board. It has to be acknowledged that, in these first few months, the requirements for a new special or heavy tank were fluid. Despite the insurance at the end of September 1939 by the General Staff of a set of improbable and perhaps impossibly optimistic requirements for a tank, the team led by Stern took liberties with their task. It is clear from reading the letters of that time, right from the start, the TOG team favoured only a turreted tank. Adding heavy armour and a high front track to help climb an enemy parapet or wall, the vehicle design resembled almost a hybrid between the existing A12 Matilda and a rival vehicle of sorts being built to a different set of demands known as the A20. When the specifications for this new tank were finally revealed at the end of September 1939, the demands were extreme. The vehicle would have to be able to cross a 16-foot wide trench without the use of a bridge or fascine, be heavily armoured, and capable of climbing a 7-foot high obstacle. The 300G was simply unable to cross such a huge gap. In an effort perhaps to assuage the General Staff and have them come around to a more conventional turreted option, the vehicle was even redrawn in a longer form capable of crossing a 10 to 12 foot wide gap. Although the goal was to produce this new special tank at just 32 tons, this longer option would obviously mean more weight, perhaps around 40 tons, and a reduced performance, assuming the same power source was to be used. Based on the drawing for the outline of the tank, it would measure around 20 foot to 25 foot long, for the compact and lengthened options respectively. The width is easier to gauge, as it is shown in a railway tunnel. Railway tunnels were a size limiter for width. The 300G vehicle completely filled the tunnel allowable width, indicating a vehicle some 10 foot wide. It is difficult to consider the automotive elements of the 300G, because the design simply never got that far. The requirements of TOG were to produce a diesel engine vehicle, and eventually that led to the adoption of the excellent Paxman Ricardo series of diesel engines for the TOG-1 and TOG-2. In the early days of that part of the work of TOG, The lack of a suitable diesel motor prompted a look at various alternatives, including the use of petrol boat engines to provide sufficient power. The designers involved in work on the SVDC project also considered alternatives to the normal kind of mechanical transmissions, eventually considering alternatives including hydraulic and electric types. However, just like the engine, this was after the 300G idea had been replaced with the work on a Mark 8 shaped machine for the general staff. As a result, the engine and transmission choices or options for a TOG tank built to the outline of the 300G remain unknown. Other than a single figure on the original drawing of a somewhat awkward-looking driver, no crew is shown. But it is hard to know how many crew were planned to man this vehicle. The special tank discussion originated with an idea for a tank with a crew of up to 7. Examining the design, it can be assumed that this would be at least 5 or maybe 6 crew members, consisting probably of a driver in the front left of the hull, a hull gunner on the front right to operate the primary armament and besa, and 3 more men, commander, gunner and loader in the turret, just as they were on the A-12. While the tank resembled an A-12, it certainly wasn't one. This tank was going to have to be able to take out heavily fortified enemy positions, and as such, a variety of guns was being considered to find whichever was suited best to the task. Among these were the 2-inch, as used on the A-12, a 3-inch howitzer, a 3.7-inch howitzer, the naval 6-pounder, and the French 75mm gun. These last two were certainly too large in a A-12 turret style. Both the 3-inch and 3.7-inch options were abandoned quickly due to them being low-velocity weapons. The solution would therefore be to mount the big gun in the hull, much in the manner of the French Char B, and use the otherwise perfectly adequate 2-pounder in the turret on top. The requirements for a front-mounted Besa machine gun in the driver's plate and another one in the turret were there to complete the complement of weapons. Although a thickness of armour is actually shown on the blueprint, this was not a to-scale drawing, just an illustrative one. The armour is shown, quite rightly, as being focused on the front, with a thick and slightly angled glacis, a cut-back lower front and a vertical and slightly thicker driver's plate. No armour is shown on the turret, which is assumed to be identical of that of the A-12, which makes it cast armour 3-inch thick all around. If 76mm is to be assumed as the basis, this would give the 300G a 3-inch thick glacis and a driver's plate perhaps as thick as 4 inches. It is certainly not possible to consider the armour to be 60mm or so, as the rival A-20 design was already known to be woefully underprotected with an armour of that thickness, unable to keep out German 37 and 47mm anti-tank guns, even at generous combat ranges. The other reason to discount that the armour was less than around 3 inches is that the armour designer on the TOG team was Kenneth Symes. Symes was an expert in armour protection, and a strong proponent of face-hardened armour plates made in flat slabs. The slabs meant an ease of production not available to castings, which need machining, but also the ability to produce a uniform hardening on the surface. Against uncapped anti-tank shot, this face-hardened armour provided improved protection over softer, homogeneous or cast armour plate. The side armour, being vertical, would have to at least match nearly vertical turret sides. So once more, 3 inches is the most reasonable estimate for this. If the relationships between thickness on the only surviving drawing are reliable, then the rear armour was about half the thickness of the front, probably around 1.5 inches thick. The death knell for what would basically have been a heavier Matilda-type tank came almost as soon as the idea was born. The General Staff were insistent that they wanted an all-round track machine with heavy unditching gear on top, which meant no turret. Lengthening the 300G would not suffice, and the attention of the old gang would be diverted into producing the RMB 17, something they very much did not want to make. to meet the exacting criteria issued by the General Staff in September 1939. The opportunity of the TOG-300G was small. The Army did not need a bigger, heavier and wider Matilda-type tank, even with the benefit of a little more armour, a little more obstacle crossing capability, and the benefit of a large front-mounted gun. They wanted something much larger, inevitably much heavier, better protected, and even more capable of crossing obstacles. Against their better judgment, that was the direction TOG was to take. And it is perhaps with some irony that the 300G style option was eventually the one adopted years later as the A-22 Churchill. That tank was to start life as much the same layout. A small cast turret with a 2-pounder gun and a 3-inch howitzer in the front, and got off to a rough start with serious design flaws, reliability issues, mobility problems, and inadequate armour and firepower. A similar fate might have been expected from the 300G, but given that the A-22 went on to be a very successful design by the end of the war, after years of upgrades to every feature, it is hard not to project that the 300G had the same sort of potential.